that she's written about the famous cemetery in Paris. She is a writer, photographer, and longtime West Hollywood resident, Carolyn Campbell.
Okay, I also want to give a big shout out to Book Soup. Remind everybody to support our independent bookstores. Yes. And my publisher, Golf Books of Nevada, California, I would not be here. So I thought it would be important to shine a light on basically how I got here. It's been a 30-year arc, and quite frankly, initially I didn't connect the dots of why I'm just kind of focused on French architecture and French design. Where did that come from? So the wonderful thing about when books take you hostage is you just sit back and go for the ride and where it takes you. And I thought back, I said, well, okay, where is there a French influence? Well, I was raised in Washington, D.C., and I flew my kite at the foot of the 13-story Washington Monument, which is a beautiful marble obelisk, and ran the length of the reflecting pool on the mall. I didn't learn until high school that Washington, D.C. was planned by a Frenchman, Pierre L'Enfant. So there is one route. And when I was about 8 years old, I would take the bus, the Potomac Park bus down Pennsylvania Avenue, past the White House, take a left turn on 17th Street to the Corcoran Gallery of Art, where I took Saturday children's art classes. In what I also later found out, the Frank Lloyd Wright called, I'm supposed to be doing this too. Okay. This is going to be tricky. This is like hand-eye coordination. Okay. Andre, where is, okay, that's supposed to do something. Okay, slide number 1. Okay. No, we're going the wrong place. There you go. Finally in the mall. There you go. Thank you. Oh, this is really going to be good for my, okay. There you go. It's very sensitive tech. Okay. The Corcoran Gallery of Art. And I was just a wee little person that spent all my Saturdays coming to this astounding place. And who would have imagined, but about 20 years later, I would be the very first, I was hired as the first public relations and special events director of this museum. Go figure. So this is where I think the real kernel of this whole Père-Lachaise thing happened was, I was in a staff meeting, and the conservator of the museum, who also moonlit as a travel agent, kind of pinched me on the shoulder and said, Carolyn, somebody just canceled on my charter, and I've got a round trip ticket to Paris. Do you want it? All you have to do is pay the tax. That would be a yes. And later that week, I was at an art opening at the museum, and a young artist came up to me and said, Carolyn, I hear you're going to Paris. I said, I know, it's my first trip to France. I can't believe it. He goes, you have to go to Père-Lachaise Cemetery. I went, Père-Lachaise, did you say cemetery? I'm going to Paris and I'm going to the cemetery. And he goes, well, aren't you a big fan of Oscar Wilde? And I said, yes. He goes, my ancestor, Jacob Epstein, carved his tomb. I had my first destination, so. Now, I want to backtrack just a minute here with this, because the one wonderful thing that I got to do is at the Corcoran is I got to do special events. And I just wanted to point out, this is the rocking that side ponytail in the 70s. This was the Salon Doré. I just had to throw this in because of a little perspective, right? Okay. Okay, so let me get to the next one here. Okay, so. My first visit was 1981, and I was totally enthralled by the experience. You can see just behind this wall, I even have my little pointer here. This is so cute. There you go. The Père-Lachaise metro station right on Boulevard Ménilmontant, and it's this wonderful wall with all of the tombs peeking out behind it, and I was totally enchanted from that moment forward. So I called a British friend of mine, who was a landscape photographer, Joe Cornish, who was my colleague in this book, and I said, you've got to come to Paris next year. Let's make a kind of a memorial photo album to this Ritz of Elysiums. So there began our journey together. And it's funny, when I called him, it was back in, I guess, this past summer, I said, Joe, we have a publishing deal. He said, thank God, I thought we would not see our book happen before we were both buried there. But what we did discover, that even Joe and I, you know, when you go someplace and you think you've discovered it, we found out that 3.5 million people go to this cemetery every year. And it is the most popular, fourth most popular destination for tourists behind the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, and what was that for? Notre Dame. It's 107 acres. And you try to take this place. On that first trip, I never found Oscar Wilde's tomb. He was on the far end of the cemetery, and I realized that they gave you a Xerox sheet, so I initially made my own map. And later that evolved into, someone said, well, it's time for tech, and I made a GPS tour app. And from that, again, all of this content that I've collected kind of morphed into the book. So I love this quote by Balzac. Now let me bring Henri to the screen. Oops, there he goes. I kind of zipped past that when I fell in love with the cemetery. Just these kinds of figures are around every corner. It's mystifying. It's almost better if you don't have a map, because getting lost is half the fun. And so it really is. So this is his quote I have from Balzac. I seldom go out, but when I feel myself flagging, I go out and cheer myself up in Père-Lachaise. While seeking out the dead, I see nothing but the living. And that was certainly my experience. So let's go back in time to why was the cemetery necessary? There were plenty of churches, plenty of graveyards, but by the end of the 1700s, when there was wars and plagues already that had filled the catacombs and all of the church graveyards. And the story goes, whether it's myth, I love it, I used it in the book, it's a good one, that the Cimetière des Innocents shared a wall with an apartment building, and a thundering roar happened one evening, and 2,000 corpses spilled through the wall. And of course, the apartment residents were not thrilled with this, and they immediately complained to the new 35-year-old first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon went to his engineers, and he said, great design you've created for Paris, but what are you going to do with the dead people? So he went to Nicolas Frochot, who was the prefect of the Seine, and he said, we've got to come up with a plan. Do something. Well, Frochot was quite a creative character, and he said, we have all of this property outside of Paris. And they decided to have a competition. And it was the first time that they'd ever commissioned an architect to build a cemetery. There were usually churches, either built within the church or on the church grounds. And so it was awarded to a landscape designer and architect, Alexander Brogniart. However, the people were not thrilled with the idea of trekking out to the countryside for visitation or a burial, nor were their bishops happy about losing money. But quite frankly, they had no choice. There was just no more room. So let me see if I've got time to switch to another picture. Okay. But Frochot, he came up to Napoleon and said, I've got a plan. It's about celebrities. So it's universal. It's been happening in 1700s. He said, I've decided I'm going to barter for some noble bones. And he got the remains of Molière and La Fontaine. Then he also got the couple, the ill-fated lovers from the 12th century, Heloise and Abelard. Boom, the cachet was set. He also kind of peppered some wonderful sculptures throughout the cemetery. Now, the cemetery, of course, was, let me just flip this wrong direction. Keep going. These, for those who have, I'm just curious, who's been to Père-Lachaise before? Oh, hand. So you all, there'll be a pop quiz after this. I know you know all of this, okay. So, Etienne Gaud, he was the city of Paris, Proust was his title. Chief architect, as a matter of fact, for the city of Paris. And I'll show you in the next slide. This is some of the classic symbols of the cemetery or funerary design are the torches here for the flame of life, and here the winged hourglass of time passing. And if you've been to a cemetery, and particularly in the Romantic area in the 19th century, this is your go-to symbolism that you'll always see. Now, this is Père-Lachaise. This is my map, but for those who purchase the book, this comes in the back of the map of the book. And where that, this was the metro station that we saw earlier. This is Boulevard Menilmontant. And when you go up this main avenue, Principal, you'll pass, there's Colette here, Visconti, the architect of the Louvre, and now I want to take you to this beautiful monument right here called Amour to the Dead. This was sculpted by Albert Bartholomé, who was a painter, and his friend Degas said, I think you want to move to sculpture. Maybe he didn't want maybe that was subtle, or maybe he didn't want competition, and he was too good. But it was initially a tribute to his wife, but as a procession of 21 adults and children going through the doorway into the afterlife. And it is larger than human scale, and I visit this one every single time. It's just really a very moving. Now this, if you go to see it now, this was probably in 1982, and I kind of like the decadence that happens to old sculptures where the lichen and the acid rain blackens things. Well, all of these trees have been cut away because they were creating too much of this, you see this black mold that's here and so forth, and now it's all polished and clean and lovely, but I like the decadence of it. That's all I can say. Let's see here. And you'll see these two doors on either side over here. This one's a little hidden away. These are the entrances to the ossuary. And it is, again, Père-Lachaise is a municipal cemetery. It's not private. It is the city of Paris. So it's definitely operational. And in the ossuary is where they store all of the remains of, say, cemeteries that have closed down, or the remains of people who were interred in Père-Lachaise and people didn't keep up the rent, or the tomb fell apart into disrepair, and they just moved them right into the ossuary. So pay your bills. When you go up that avenue, immediately to your right is one of the oldest and densest areas of the cemetery, and it's called the Romantic section. And this is part of the first original 16 acres. And you can see this was in the fall, and for me, it's just dreamy. It's very crowded, but there are paths that you can move through. And the history with it is that the original site was named after Father Lachaise, who was a Jesuit confessor to the Sun King, Louis XIV. And the story goes that Louis said, if you forgive me my sins, I'll give you this great acreage out in the country. I love the stories, and it's very French, and I believe it, so I'm going with it. But I was unaware that there are mountains in Paris. Mont Louis, which is this one, Montmartre, and Montparnasse. So this one is about, I think Père-Lachaise is about 1,000-foot elevation. So from the people that go there in the winter, it's quite cold and it's windy. But it's also because it was a retreat, it had orange groves, it had rose gardens and rolling hills. So you can imagine Brochet, landscape architect, was in heaven, that he was assigned to work with this already existing beautiful geography. Okay, so now one of the things that has really kind of astounded me, that at that time, no expense was spared and no extravagance overlooked in creating what became really a phenomenal outdoor museum of architecture and design. At the time, Napoleon wanted this to be a cemetery for everybody. So it didn't matter if you were a pauper, there were places, but it became very competitive for the families to commission a leading architect and sculptor to create a major, monument to them. So you'll see Romanesque and neoclassical, all of these wonderful different architectural periods. And because Paris transformed during the time of Baron von Haussmann, who made those wide sweeping boulevards like the Champs-Élysées, they lost a lot of the architectural history of Paris. There's still plenty there. But because Père-Lachaise has been around since 1804, all of the examples of architecture throughout the centuries are there to be seen. So one of the reasons I created the book was so that people really realize what they're seeing, what they're surrounded by, is more than just the history of the people of Paris, but a whole arc of architecture that happened during those years. Now, statues of women in the 18th century often represented the 7 virtues. I always have to look this up because why do I not remember the 7 virtues of women? Prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, faith, hope, and charity. Power examples of how women are seen to embody some of the deepest qualities of the human condition. So, oh, sorry, I forgot to show other examples of architecture. Again, this relating to what I saw in Washington, D.C. of the obelisk. And then one of the few, this is Guimard, Hector Guimard, who designed all of the metro stations in Paris. And so this is one of the 2 tombs in Père-Lachaise that are his designs, and you can see the influence of Art Nouveau. They're beautiful. This is right on the right-hand side as you go into the entrance. So now we get back to the women. Oh, I'm missing the women. Where did the women go? I think I have to go through some other design first. This sounded so orderly in my bathroom last night when I was practicing. But this is one of my favorites. When we have our refreshments later, I have lots of bat cookies because I just love the symbol of the bats. It was just the architects and designers really saw the eternal staying power of funerary monuments and that visceral awe in the land of the dead. I mean, they had so much fun in the spooky element. But it was, again, it was a very kind of Christian thing to be afraid of death. Your sins, are you ready to go to heaven? I mean, there's this an intense thing about it, which the city of Paris tried to undo by creating more figures like a bucolic angel. And you saw this switch happen that all of the skull imagery of death and everything and the Christian-based imagery of sadness was being shifted to the interpretation of the word cemetery, which means a place where one sleeps. So they're really kind of getting back to the root of what a cemetery was about. So you'll see these cherubs, and they come here kind of adolescents. They can be women, they can be adults, but there's in all different age groups. And I just love this little chubby guy. He's just, what he's got, you see, it's very kind of hard to see here, but this is an hourglass here that he's leaning against. Now I think we're ready for women. Yes? No. Here we are. This was a symbol, it's called le douleur, and it means grief. And again, the female, the very powerful emotional entity of that female body. And there's a myriad of these, but this is one of my particular favorites. Now, I had to think when I saw this next piece that in The Family Goes to the Grave site, I hear that a sculptor has been commissioned to create this female, and it didn't necessarily mean that a female was entombed there. It usually symbolized a grace or the charity of the individual who was buried there, so it could be a man. But I thought, what did the family think when this woman is obviously more in erotic rapture than grieving? But again, it's up to the person who commissioned, so that's how it went. What has been, in all of this beauty that is there, the future, in my opinion, is very perilous for all of this beautiful sculpture and architecture in Père-Lachaise, due to a variety of things. Climate change, acid rain, vandalism. There was a period in the 90s where I just saw so many bronze sculptures disappear because of their scrap metal value. It was just very, very heartbreaking to see it happen. And through fashion and fate, a lot of these famous and bourgeois families have nothing to kind of memorialize their family members. But and one in particular was Oscar Wilde's tomb. For those who had visited, this is back in the 90s, where people had this habit of kissing his tomb. And it was kind of over-enthusiastic adoration, but they had no idea that the lipstick and the oil from the lipstick was seeping into the porous limestone and destroying it. So every time it was cleaned, another layer of Jacob Epstein's design got wiped away. So it was finally the, and this is one of the wonderful kind of aspects that happens when you do research, and being here in LA, the William Andrews Clark Library in West Adams, for anybody who's a Wildean fan, is the largest repository of literature and materials on Oscar Wilde anywhere in the world. And they would have symposiums every once in a while, and one year, Oscar Wilde's only grandson, Roland Holland, came to LA. So I got to interview him, and he wasn't really disturbed by this so much, because it was obviously passion for Wilde, but he said, we're going to lose it eventually. So the Irish, there was a historic society in Dublin that got together and put up this, first of all, they did a really wonderful and very sensitive cleaning, and then erected this plexiglass shield, which is not exactly the most aesthetic thing, but it will preserve the tomb. So I'm glad it's there. And it's really, again, it's on the far northern side. I would never have found this tomb on my first visit had I not had a lot of input from the people at the Wilde home. Now, visitors to Père-Lachaise, many times they're pilgrims. They're coming there either to visit a writer like Proust or Balzac, and they come with all kinds of mementos. I'm sure everyone's heard about Jim Morrison, everybody dropping joints and bottles of booze and all of that. And I found this a really interesting kind of totem that just recently happened at the Tomb of Writers, and it's a jar of pens. And that either you could pick a pen and just write a note, or it was just kind of an interesting symbol. So here at Père-Lachaise, we are confronted with the great paradox of this vast burial ground, which embraces serenity, horror, anguish, and acceptance. The grand sweep of the human experience. Day after day, year after year, the city of Immortals waits its next visitor. And I just want to leave you with this one message. This came up midway through my writing the book. It was a message that my dad gave me on his deathbed. He passed away at 64, shortly after getting his 35-year, 100% pension from the federal government. His dream was to go back and finish college and continue writing that he had put away while he raised 3 daughters and sent them to private universities. He never did any of that, but he did give me the gift of his experience. He told me, Carolyn, never put off your dreams. So I wish the same for everyone here. Do it now. Life is short. Thank you.